So we've got sensations, perceptions, and then we've got things that we call feelings/emotions. And these get a little complicated because almost all of us, I would hope all of us, are familiar with things like happiness and sadness or boredom or frustration. Scientists argue like crazy, neuroscientists and psychologists and philosophers for that matter, argue like crazy about what these are and how they work. Certainly, emotions and feelings are the product of the nervous system. They involve the activity of neurons. But as I mentioned earlier, neurons are electrically active, but they also release chemicals. And there's a certain category of chemicals that has a very profound influence on our emotional states. They're called neuromodulators. And those neuromodulators have names that probably you've heard of before, things like dopamine and serotonin and acetylcholine, epinephrine. Neuromodulators are really interesting because they bias which neurons are likely to be active and which ones are likely to be inactive. A simple way to think about neuromodulators is they are sort of like playlists that you would have on any kind of device where you're going to play particular categories of music. So for instance, dopamine, which is often discussed as the molecule of reward or joy, is involved in reward, and it does tend to create a sort of upbeat mood when released in appropriate amounts in the brain. But the reason it does that is because it makes certain neurons and neural circuits, as we call them, more active and others less active. Okay, so serotonin, for instance, is a molecule that when released tends to make us feel really good with what we have, our sort of internal landscape and the resources that we have, whereas dopamine, more than being a molecule of reward, is really more a molecule of motivation toward things that are outside us and that we want to pursue. And we can look at healthy conditions or situations like being in pursuit of a goal where every time we accomplish something en route to that goal, a little bit of dopamine is released and we feel more motivation. That happens. We can also look at the extreme example of something like mania, where somebody is so, relentlessly in pursuit of external things like money and relationships that they're sort of in this delusional state of thinking that they have the resources that they need in order to pursue all these things when in fact they don't. So these neuromodulators can exist in normal levels, low levels, high levels, and that actually gives us a window into a very important aspect of neuroscience history that all of us are impacted by today, which is the discovery of antidepressants and so-called antipsychotics. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it was discovered that there are compounds, chemicals, that can increase or decrease serotonin, that can increase or decrease dopamine. And that led to the development of most of what we call antidepressants. Now, the trick here, or the problem, is that most of these drugs, especially in the 1950s and 60s, they would reduce serotonin, but they would also reduce dopamine, or they would increase serotonin, but they would also increase some other neuromodulator or chemical. And that's because all these chemical systems in the body, but the neuromodulators in particular, have a lot of receptors. Now, these are different than the receptors we were talking about earlier. The receptors I'm talking about now are sort of like parking spots where dopamine is released, and if it attaches to a receptor, say on the heart, it might make the heart beat faster because there's a certain kind of receptor on the heart. Whereas if dopamine is released and goes and attaches to muscle, it might have a completely different effect on muscle. And in fact, it does. So different receptors on different organs of the body are the ways that these neuromodulators can have all these different effects on different aspects of our biology. This is most salient in the example of some of the antidepressants that have sexual side effects, or that blunt appetite, or that blunt motivation. Many of these, which increase serotonin, can be very beneficial for people. It can elevate their mood, it can make them feel better, but they also, if the doses are too high, or if that particular drug isn't right for somebody, that person experiences challenges with motivation or appetite or libido because serotonin is binding to receptors in the areas of the brain that control those other things as well. So we talked about sensation, we talked about perception. When we talk about feelings, we have to consider these neuromodulators. And we have to consider also that feelings and emotions are contextual. In some cultures, Showing a lot of joy or a lot of sadness is entirely appropriate. In other cultures, it's considered inappropriate. So I don't think it's fair to say that there's a sadness circuit or area of the brain or a happiness circuit or area of the brain. However, it is fair to say that certain chemicals and certain brain circuits tend to be active when we are in motivated states, tend to be active when we are in non-motivated, lazy states, tend to be active when we are focused, and tend to be active when we are not focused. I want to emphasize also that emotions are something that we generally feel are not under our control. We feel like they kind of geyser up within us and they just kind of happen to us. And that's because they are somewhat reflexive. We don't really set out with a deliberate thought to be happy or deliberate thought to be sad. We tend to experience them in kind of a passive, reflexive way.